Hello, I'm Hana Levay, Collection Assessment Librarian at the University of Washington. Today I'm presenting with Sidonie Devarenne, MLIS candidate at the University of Washington. Thank you for attending our session on accessibility and VPATs. First, we're going to give a brief overview of web accessibility, and then we will discuss keyboard navigation testing and VPAT analysis as ways to rank resources according to their probability of accessibility. The World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, defines web accessibility as websites, tools, and technologies that are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. They can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, as well as contribute to the web. How do we know if web content is accessible? The W3C has developed Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG. These guidelines determine if web content is accessible when it meets certain success criteria. The current WCAG version is 2.1. WCAG 2.1 at the AAA level of success criteria is the top level of accessibility. WCAG version 2.2 is coming very soon. We don't know exactly when, but it is being finalized as we speak. WCAG has 13 guidelines, and each of those guidelines has multiple success criteria. Each success criteria has an assigned level of A, AA, or AAA. Level A criteria are the core criteria required to meet the minimum acceptable level of accessibility. The AAA level is the top level. These criteria, where it would be great to have these, but it's very unusual that a website would have all AAA level of accessibility guidelines criteria. Let's look at one of these guidelines in particular. WCAG Guideline 1.2 is for time-based media. The goal is to provide an alternative to time-based media. So a level A success criteria example is captions provided for pre-recorded video. At the AA level, it's captions provided for live video. And at the AAA level, sign language interpretation provided for pre-recorded video. So as you can see, each level steps up to more accessible features. Guideline 1.2 has 9 total success criteria, each one assigned a level of A, AA, or AAA. Why do we need to know if web content is accessible? Well, besides being an important civil rights issue, there are federal guidelines and often state guidelines that require federal agencies or state agencies to provide, develop, procure, maintain, and use information technology that is accessible to all people. And there have been many legal cases, including a recent case, Payan versus Los Angeles Community College District, that ruled that the LACCD must discontinue use of inaccessible library databases. And by that, the judge specified that they must conform to WCAG 2.1 level AA success criteria. So that's the middle level. From the example before, that would be where captions are available for live video. So that's a pretty high standard. This ruling gave many libraries a bit of a panic moment. So which library resources are not accessible? To find out, we can do manual testing. There's a variety of accessibility tools you can use to manually test web content, browser tools and plugins like accessibility bookmarklets and Totally. You can test with screen readers like NVDA. You can do keyboard navigation testing and test with other assistive technologies. Or rather than manual testing, you can collect VPATs. A VPAT is a voluntary product accessibility template which itemizes each WCAG success criteria for each of the 13 guidelines I mentioned. And the vendor is responsible for declaring if their product supports each of those guidelines and at what level. So we can collect the VPAT reports. We can somehow manually assess each resource for each success criteria, but all these options are huge projects. Most of us don't have the expertise to get started, and it can feel overwhelming. This is where many of us are now. So how do we get started? Let's remember what is our goal. We want to improve the accessibility of subscribed third-party library resources. And we have these barriers, the constraints. The VPATs are hard to read, are complicated, and many are actually unreliable. Libraries, of course, have no control over the development of the third-party resources. We can't actually make any fixes. And libraries subscribe to so many resources that it's a very large project. And accessibility testing tools are often difficult to learn. Finally, we often have no budget or time to address these issues. We have to do this work as part of our regular workload with no additional resources. So plan of action. At the University of Washington, we decided to do a combination of keyboard testing and VPAT assessment to find out which electronic resources are most likely to not be accessible. Then we will negotiate with those vendors of the inaccessible products, work with them to encourage them to improve the accessibility of their products. We chose to use keyboard testing to manually test our subscribed resources because it is easy to learn, easy to use, and there's no software to download. And generally speaking, if a website is accessible using keyboard navigation, it will also work with various assistive technologies. There's a quote from the W3C. An accessible website does not rely on the mouse. It makes all functionality available from a keyboard. Then people with disabilities can use assistive technologies that mimic the keyboard. Here I've listed the keyboard navigation commands that we use. I'm not going to read them all, but basically you just hit Tab to navigate forward through the page, or Shift Tab to go backwards. Enter and spacebar activate buttons and links, and that's pretty much it. It's very easy to learn and easy to use. So then once we settle on keyboard testing, we tried to see if we could use only the keyboard and complete the main actions that a researcher would do. Can you search? Can you select a search result? Can you interact with the search result, like turn pages? And for media, can you play and pause the content? And at this time, we're not testing the content itself, just the interface around the content. So this test really just finds if common actions can be accomplished. It doesn't test for all the different kinds of other accessibility, like captions or contrast. But given our constraints, keyboard testing gives us a pretty good picture of accessibility for the resource. At the last count that I did for our keyboard testing results, we went through every resource and tested it with just the keyboard. We tested 606 resources, and 90% of those passed. We were able to use keyboard navigation to accomplish the main research tasks. 10% failed. So we know that we need to look harder at those 10% of resources. And we published the results of our keyboard testing on a public page. And here's an excerpt from the public page. And this is available for anyone to view and look at. So I'll hand it over to Sid for VPATs.
So what about VPATs? Separately, we did a VPAT assessment. So a quick overview of VPATs. A VPAT is a voluntary product accessibility template. There's a link on the slide here to the current VPAT report template, which is version 2.4 as of February 2020. The challenge with VPATs is they can be long and complicated and overwhelming to read, especially for anyone new to accessibility. And having a VPAT does not necessarily mean that a resource is accessible. Ideally, a third-party accessibility consultant will be the one filling out a VPAT for a company and testing for each success criteria. But in reality, it's often filled out by a vendor's marketing team who have very little accessibility expertise, and they've just been asked to fill out this form. So we get a whole range of results. Because VPATs can be so long and complicated, we have decided to look at just a few key details in each VPAT. These details were drawn from a webinar called Accessibility in Procurement, which suggested that these are the most important elements of a VPAT. These key details give us a very good sense of the overall quality of the VPAT. These key details include metadata, like for name, date, contact, applicable standards, and evaluation methods used. I've included an example here of the top of a blank VPAT showing the metadata section. And then later in the form, we look at just 3 success criteria. Section 1.3.1, Information and Relationships, Section 2.1.1, Keyboard Testing, and Section 4.1.2, Name, Role, and Value. Depending on how the metadata is filled out, you can learn a lot about the quality of the VPAT itself. Here's an example of the Level A success criteria from a blank VPAT. You can see here that for each guideline, there are 1 or more success criteria for Level A. The vendor would go into the conformance level field and enter supports, partially supports, or does not support, and then support that conformance level with comments in the remarks and explanation fields. We like to see a lot of comments in this field. Next would be the AA criteria, and then the AAA criteria, which are not shown here. We've mentioned collecting VPATs. If you don't already have VPATs collected, you can often find them publicly available. VPATs are specific to the vendor, not to the license. So here are some tips for finding VPATs. Best case scenario, the vendor will make their VPAT available on their site. Some resources have a link to their accessibility policies and documentation in the site header or footer. Others link to this information in the About, Help, or Knowledge Base sections of their site. And VPATs for platforms owned by large vendors may be located on the parent company's website. If it's not clear how to find the VPAT on the site, try a site search or try using Google to locate it. You may also find that another library has published the vendor VPAT on their site, though you will need to make sure it is the most recent version. And then finally, some vendors make their VPATs available by request only. So for our VPAT metadata project, we reviewed our VPATs that we had collected and extracted the data I referred to for those key details. We directly copied the text for the selected VPAT sections into a spreadsheet, with the exception of evaluation methods. We tried to summarize evaluation methods information as blank if they left it blank, minimal if they just said something vague, or full if they really itemized each tool that they used to test. We encountered some challenges collecting this metadata. We found that many VPATs are not actually filled out completely. Also, sometimes it was hard to use the scale to summarize the evaluation methods used because the different vendors have different level of detail used to describe the evaluation methods. For example, they might just say that they used assistive technologies versus naming specific products, or that testing is based on general product knowledge, which is very vague, and we would probably say that's minimal. Ultimately, we found a range of detail provided in VPATs. Some indicated a thorough assessment of their product, while others didn't really tell us much. Here is more detail about the VPATs we found unhelpful. Some vendors used out-of-date VPAT templates. In the case of vendors leaving the remarks and explanations field blank, like this example from the American Psychiatric Association, or if they simply pasted in the official success criteria, we couldn't really evaluate how closely they assessed their resource. Similarly, a VPAT doesn't tell us much if we don't know any details about their evaluation methods, like these examples from Geoscience World or Canopy. The VPATs we found helpful gave us information that showed the resource had been thoroughly tested. The remarks and explanations field were filled out with specific detail about the resource. On the right is a screenshot from the Wiley VPAT. You can see all this information just for guideline 4.1.2, name, role, and value. This vendor has entered that it partially supports the success criteria, and then a whole page of notes in the remarks and explanation field about what it supports and exceptions. It's very verbose and clear that they really looked into it and really thoroughly tested it. One thing to notice here is that we almost don't even need to read all of the text. The fact that they have put so many comments supports the idea that they have put time into filling out the VPAT. Similarly, in the evaluation methods used section, when a vendor shares specifics about their testing, it helps us to know that thorough testing was conducted, like in this screenshot from the Alexander Street VPAT. Though thoroughly tested resources might even be more likely to call out their product as being in partial conformance because they've really taken the time to investigate.
So once we have the VPAT metadata collected, how do we assess it? I took the results of our keyboard testing and the spreadsheet from our VPAT assessment and put them together into a rubric with 4 elements. 0 is the best score for each section, and then points are added where each point is a mark against the resource. First, we have the VPAT completion score. This just considers how does it look? If it's out of date, are there a lot of comments? One time we even just received a blank template back from a vendor with no edits at all. And that's not very helpful. That would give them a 3. And then sometimes they have a complete VPAT, all the fields filled out, lots of comments. It looks great. That would be a 0. Next, we have a VPAT success score. So that's looking at what it actually says. So Does it mostly have supports with lots of comments? And they listed out the various methods they used to evaluate it. That looks great. That would be a 0. If it's mostly does not support, has no comments, and they don't even mention their evaluation methods, that is not great. That would be a 3. Next, we bring in the keyboard navigation test. It gets a 3 if it failed and 0 if it passed. And for the final one, I checked to see if the VPATs 2.1.1 keyboard testing success criteria and our keyboard navigation test agree with each other. So it gets 0 if they agree and a 1 if they don't agree. For the overall score, the higher the score is the higher risk of inaccessibility, and it ranges from 0 to 10. So here's a screenshot for some of our VPAT rubric scores. And this was sorted from lowest to highest score. So here's a handful of resources that returned very good scores on the VPAT assessment and passed the keyboard test. These resources are most likely accessible. Again, we're not testing the resource to see if it actually is accessible. We're more getting a sense of which resources are probably accessible or probably not accessible. And here's the results list sorted from highest to lowest score. These resources are most likely to be inaccessible. So the conclusion for our VPAT metadata work, we were able to do 53 complete assessments with the rubric at this time. We had 65 VPATs collected, and some didn't have keyboard test results, so we did 53. We found some good information. We found that about 15% had higher scores, which means they're more likely to be inaccessible. These results give us a list that is more nuanced than just a pass-fail. For example, the keyboard test is a pass-fail kind of test. So when you combine the VPAT metadata and the keyboard test, we create a ranked list of resources and vendors to find which vendors are more likely to have inaccessible products. This helps us refine our scope so that moving forward, we can focus on communicating with the vendor who scored the highest. Remember, that indicates their products are more likely to be inaccessible. So what we can do, we can work with those vendors. We can ask them to add accessibility, like adding accessibility language to the license. We can ask for a 1-year license with the intent to renew next year only if accessibility improvements are made in that time. We can include accessibility findings as a factor when considering products to license or to cancel. And just overall, we can inform vendors that accessibility impacts our decision making. Vendors need to work with us to improve accessibility. They are our partners in this work, not our adversaries. I found that often a vendor is not aware that their product is not accessible, and they appreciate working with us and learning how to improve their products. So here I include a list of additional resources, some of which I've mentioned already. First, I want to highlight the Library Accessibility Alliance. This is an alliance of about 100 libraries who work together to promote equitable access to library resources. The LIA provides some model license language to use in new licenses and a toolkit for getting started. They also do thorough accessibility tests with third-party accessibility consultants, and their reports are available on their testing page. You can go there and read the results. You can also read if the vendor has responded and get more information about very specific details for these resources. There's also an e-resource evaluation suggestion form to suggest new resources to test that aren't already on the list. If you want to learn more about the LAA, be sure to catch these other 2 presentations at ER&L this year. And I'm on the LAA testing subcommittee, so you can also contact me if you want to learn more. And other resources here are the WCAG guidelines, the UW keyboard testing results page, some VPAT repositories we found, and the webinar Accessibility and Procurement that does a deep dive into VPAT analysis. So thank you for attending our talk. If you want to get in touch, you can email me at levay@uw.edu or sid@sidonie@uw.edu. Thank you.